Hello, you're listening to Drawing the Ideal Self podcast for March 2023. In today's episode of the podcast, we're going to look at construing admin. All of us have some sort of admin to do, so we'll have a think about that. It's easy to think that admin is only associated with work, when actually it isn't. In order to run a house, we would need to pay the bills on time, fill the car with petrol, let the dog out, clean the toilet, all of the kind of ordinary things. And if you think of those as admin, there are some of them that are related to running a house which you won't like doing, but you still do, or that you do love doing and you do a lot at the expense of some of the other things. I certainly have a preference for tidying the garden over tidying the house. And part of that is about being outside, part of it is about novelty, because I haven't been a gardener for so long. And part of it is about creating something which looks really nice and that I can enjoy. Whereas hoovering the floor doesn't give me that same kind of satisfaction, although it has to be done. You'll notice admin when you face a certain situation that has a lot of things attached to it. So recently I went on holiday, and in order to do something as simple as that, you have to make arrangements for whoever or whatever animals you're leaving behind. So maybe children, maybe dogs, maybe cats, guinea pigs. All of those things have to be addressed before you can even think about going on holiday. You have to pack your case, you have to find all the right clothing for the weather, you have to get your passport ready and other things that you will need to take with you. Nowadays you have to remember so many cables to take to make your electronics work. You've got to make sure you've got all your essential toiletries. So these are all admin type tasks, and everybody has to do admin, whether it's related to work or not. So even children will be doing some kind of admin. They might have to pack their lunchbox. They might have to empty their lunchbox when they come home from school. They might need to get their homework sorted out and organise which homework they're doing when. They might need also to get their kit ready for a sports class or dancing or whatever else they might go to. And parents will know if those things aren't done, what a load of hassle it causes. But if they aren't done, often it's because people are doing something else. And with children, we notice that a lot more than we may do with adults. So if your child is sitting still watching TV when they need to be putting their brownie uniform on, then you might feel really irritated by that, and you're very conscious that they're making a choice. However, it's pretty much the same choice that you might make when you don't mop the kitchen floor, which needs doing, and instead you go and cut the flowers in the garden. Not that that's me. We know that work can be very stressful for people, and so can the admin around other tasks. So I've made an example of a way that you could work through this, and that would be to explore your own response to construing admin. Now, the reason I've picked an example which is related to work is because that's a pretty common one, and most people who listen to this podcast probably can identify with that quite easily. So I know that a lot of people are people who are working with other people. That definitely requires a whole lot of admin to go alongside it. So what I've done is create a document which I'll put on my website, and you can download it, and obviously it's free. And it's called Construing Your Admin Tasks, Why Are Some More Difficult for You? With an idea that it helps you to understand why you might put some tasks off, which are very important, and also come to some conclusions about maybe what you could try out to help yourself to do things a bit differently if you're feeling stuck. There's no expectation that you will be unhappy with your situation, because there isn't with putting things off. Some people like it. Some people find it a much more efficient way to work. And as always in PCP, the way we construe admin is entirely personal. These tasks are neutral. We might not think they're very pleasant, but in themselves, they're neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And remember that what Kelly was saying was that it's the way you construe which leads to your behaviour. And behaviour and construing are all tied up together. So if you construe your admin as awful, the way you sit at your desk may be affected by that. The way that you don't open a document when it's sitting there waiting for you to read it. The personal construing is really important. And the reason I've done this episode is I listened to a podcast which I have lost, and I can't remember which app it was on or what program it was on, but it was interesting, and it was about procrastination. And basically it was saying that that's related to your values. So it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. And we would understand that as PCP people, that, the way we construe things is what determines whether it's an okay thing for us or it isn't. There is quite a lot of hype about procrastination, as if it is always bad. Now, I had some information from a blog that I read, which was about a technique to address procrastination, really. And that was interesting. But it's a fairly standard technique, working in blocks of time, giving yourself a time off at the end of it, so that you're working in shorter bursts rather than long stretches of time. Whether or not you find that useful will be related to your personal construing. For me, that's not the way I work best. One of the things that I find I do is wrap my legs around the chair when I'm really wanting to get up, because I need to just finish a few more sentences, otherwise I'm going to lose my train of thought. One of the things that's very relevant to this in terms of personal construct psychology is guilt. So Kelly's definition of guilt is the awareness of dislodgement from a core role. And we've done a session on guilt before in a previous podcast episode. I've just checked, and it was actually episode 4, which was in 2020. So what Kelly said about guilt is that really this is about the awareness that you are not playing a role which is very important to you in the way that you want to do it. So for me as a psychologist, it might be that by not getting a report done, I am not being a proper psychologist, and that makes me feel bad. So I might feel really, really awful, or not too bad, depending on what it is and how important it is to me to get that particular report out. I don't think that all reports are equal. So some are more difficult to write than others. And it isn't just about the amount of paperwork I might have to read that's related to it. It's also about what I'm going to write about and how much effort I've got to put in to expressing it in a way that is going to work for the purpose of the report. And if I don't give that enough attention, I will feel guilt in a Kellyan sense. I will feel like I'm not being a proper psychologist, and I really need to do something about that. What I think is interesting is the close relationship between our personal construing and the things we decide to do immediately or do later. And what I've done is design really a way of exploring that. So it's based on, first of all, writing a short account of the admin things that you have to do. And you could use that related to a work situation or a home situation, it doesn't really matter. You could also use it with a young person who might be struggling with their studies and try and elaborate why they're struggling. So although this exercise is quite specific, because the example in it is about the kind of job that I might do, it can be modified according to what you need to explore. The exercise is designed for you to do it on your own, if you want to do that, or you could work in a pair with somebody else. Or you could do it separately alongside a number of other people and then look at your results together and help each other to think about them. So it's quite flexible, but what I would recommend is that you definitely have a discussion about confidentiality before you begin. So if you're going to do it with somebody else, you make sure that you have agreed what happens to this information. What you don't want is somebody to be telling other people or weaving it into an appraisal or something like that without anticipating that that's going to happen. The same would apply if you're using it with a young person, that you need to have a discussion at the beginning about what it is you're going to be doing and why you think it may be helpful, and then a further agreement at the end about what happens to what you've done. Can it be shared with people or not? On the whole, I would recommend doing it in a pair, because people's questioning of you is probably more likely to help you to think than if you question your own self. I've written it as if you're doing it on your own, but if you worked with somebody else and you took turns and each interviewed the other, perhaps on 2 consecutive weeks or something like that, you could come up with some interesting discussions, and then you've got a built-in support to comment or notice any changes you decide you might make, or to notice that you're not going to make any changes and that things are going to carry on, and try and help you to stick to that. So this exercise falls outside any suggestion that you must do something about any issues that you find difficult with your admin. You can choose all the time to do nothing. If you want to, you can try and do something about it as an experiment, but it would be an experiment because you don't know if it's going to be helpful or not. But don't feel that you must. It may be enough just to explore. And it may be that you find that by exploring and thinking this stuff through very carefully, you gradually make some changes that are maybe week by week almost imperceptible, but if you looked over a year, actually are very significant. And sometimes you might need to, first of all, make yourself more aware of what the issues are and give yourself time to mull those over before you decide to do anything about it, if you do. So here's what you would do for this process. So all you need in terms of equipment is some paper and pen. Ideally, you want a few sheets of paper because you may want to have some that you're writing on, but also some that you're going to tear up into smaller pieces when you do eliciting constructs. So it starts with asking you to write a short piece about your admin tasks. Don't go into details about this because the details are going to be explored in a grid. So you just want something quite basic. So I had a go at this and this is what I said. So I don't like many admin tasks, but they're all important. They help people to move through the system, freeing up space for the new ones to be seen. Some tasks take ages, but some are pretty quick. Some that I think should be quick actually take a lot of fiddling to get right, like arranging new appointments. Reports take a long time and require a chunk of time so that I can get it completed in one session. They need me to keep other things out of my head and to concentrate for a long time. I usually cut myself off to do them, so the experience can be rather lonely, just me and the computer. I prefer talking to people, like making phone calls or consulting colleagues. However, they can take a long time if the person is not available straight away. I have to double check everything I write and reread my work. It is very easy to be inaccurate, and dates and details have to be precise. All documents have to be formatted appropriately for the type of writing, which always takes longer than I expect. I have emails to answer and send, even more now I work remotely. I also have to add my notes and information to the central computer system. That is not interesting, and it has to be done very close to the appointment, adding a time pressure. Now, if you've listened to that carefully, you might already be thinking, ooh, I can hear some things to explore in there that you'd like to get your teeth into. So the next step of this is to go through that piece and highlight the constructs. So you can either underline them, circle them, use a highlighting pencil, whatever you want to do. So there was something about tasks being important. There was something about people moving through the system. There was something about them taking ages or being quick. Some things that take a lot of time to get, a lot of fiddling to get right. Some things about things taking a long time and requiring a chunk of time. There's something about keeping other things out of my head and concentrating for a long time. Also cutting myself off, and that experience being rather lonely. I prefer talking to people, but that can take a long time if the person isn't available straight away. And I have to double check things because the work has to be precise. Formatting takes longer than I expect, and things are interesting or not and might have a time pressure. So the next step is to find the contrast poles to these constructs. So if I just run through some of mine, important as opposed to does not matter. Moving through the system compared with people getting stuck in the system. Taking ages rather than quick. Something being quick rather than taking a long time. And you can hear that those two are really, really similar. So the other thing that you need to do is once you've got your list of constructs and contrast poles, go through them and see if there is a construct which will fit for a few of them. So in my case, I had take ages and quick and takes a long time, can take a long time, often quick to do, concentrate for a long time, easy to finish. So I replaced those with one construct, which was quick and takes a long time, because I felt that would cover all of those things. I had some as well that could be grouped together and that were about being cut off or sociable. So I finally ended up with a list of 10 constructs, but for the purpose of this exercise, I only want to use 7. So I needed to have a way to decide which ones were the most important. So it's just going through each one and saying, okay, which is more important than any other? They're not necessarily going to be in a tight order for something like this. It's more about deciding which ones can be discarded. The next step is to adjust your list of elements. So in that first little piece that I wrote, there are a number of tasks that were there. These are elements. So these are the things, the tasks that I construe when I'm thinking about admin. So they were things like arranging new appointments, reports, phone calls, consulting colleagues, double checking everything I write and rereading, and emails, sending and answering, and adding notes to the computer system. So I reworded a few of those. So I changed arranging new appointments to just arranging appointments, and double checking everything I write and rereading my work to editing, proofreading. And then I changed adding my notes to the central computer system to add notes to system, just because I know what I'm talking about there. I don't need central computer system because I need to fit it into the grid and there's not so much space. So the next step is to lay out the grid, and on the top line of the grid you're going to have 7 boxes, and each one of those will have one of these elements in. So one of the things that is an admin task that you're going to construe with your constructs. So that's the things like arranging appointments, reports, phone calls, consulting colleagues, editing, proofreading, emails, adding notes to system. On the left side of the grid, so for each row, there is a construct, and these constructs have been put in order of preference. So important does not matter. Important was my preferred pole of that construct, so important is written first. And then the next one is move people through the system rather than people get stuck in the system. Moving people through is my preference. Being quick or taking a long time, quick is my preference. Sociable rather than cut off, sociable is my preference. Think of a number of things at a time rather than keep other things out of my head. So thinking of a number of things at a time is my preference. That was quite interesting because I realised that some of the things that I have to do require absolute focus, and I'm not so keen on that. I like to have a number of ideas in my head at once. Then precise versus inaccurate, and interesting rather than boring. And this example is in the document so that you can copy it if you want to. And just go through it step by step and do exactly what I've done and see where it takes you. So once you've got that grid set up, you then need to use each construct and construe the elements. So the way I'm suggesting you do that is take each construct in turn and see how it applies to the elements. So if you take important rather than does not matter. So important is the preferred poll. So which is the most important of those admin tasks? And then which is the least important of those admin tasks? So now I've got 5 elements left from the original list of 7. And again, I'd say which is the most important and which is the least important. And then I'm left with 3. And of those 3, which is the most important, which is the least, and then I've got the middle one. It tells you how I'm rating them. So the most important is given a number 1, and the least important is given a 7. Probably it doesn't matter too much whether you want to use the numbers that way round or you want 7 as your largest. Because it's a bigger number, you want that maybe to represent the most important. I prefer it that number 1 is the most important, but as long as you're consistent in every row, it's fine. Remember though, if you're doing this with someone else, to make sure that you agree how you're going to rate them. So is the most one going to be rated as 1 or is it going to be 7? And a way to make this easier is to write the elements on little pieces of paper and then turn them over as they're selected. So you don't have to keep looking at the whole list. So, or you can move them out of the way, doesn't really matter. I think I prefer them turned over so you always have 7 because you're going to need to turn them back again in a second. So you'd say, which is the most important? Arranging appointments. Okay, so turn that over now, that's been used. Which is the least important? Emails. So turn that over, that's been used. Of the ones that are left, which is the most important? Reports. Which is the least important? Adding notes to the system, etc. This is probably really quite boring and difficult to understand as an audio thing, but if you have it in front of you when you listen to this, it will probably make a lot more sense. So you will have a completed grid, and then you're going to look at the scores and notice things about it. So this is called eyeballing. What it'll probably do is raise more questions than answers, things for you to explore in a bit more detail. So in my case, a few things from this is that the ratings on the first 2 rows turned out to be very similar. So the question would be, I wonder why that is. And was that a surprise or not? Or is it what you would expect? And actually, in my case, the downside of writing reports was that it's the most cut-off task, takes a long time, it's the most precise, requiring concentrated effort, but it is also the second most important task. So the question I asked myself is, okay, why is that? And it's because it represents the end of a piece of work so that it's kind of rounded off and you get a worthwhile input. So it starts with arranging the appointment and it ends with a report. So on the document, I've put a few examples of things that I picked out of mine. You will look at it and think of others that you would like to explore. And you could choose to either use laddering or pyramiding to explore that further, or just talk about them. You don't have to use those techniques. There has been a podcast episode on laddering, which would be a really good idea to listen to. That's episode 32, before you do it, if you've forgotten how to do laddering or if you've never known. It's not complicated in itself, but it's complicated to make it work quite fluidly. In my case, I laddered something that came from the thinking around it, which was actually put writing and recording tasks off rather than shutting myself away to do them. And which do I prefer? I prefer to put them off. And why do I prefer to put them off? Because it can be lonely doing them, as opposed to being a sociable experience. And I like talking to people because they're interesting, stimulating, and life is interesting and rich, and that makes me happy. So actually, it makes a lot of sense for me not to do my admin in the way people might think. So maybe you would think, get the big task done first because that's going to be the biggest one and then it's out of the way. Or get the adding people onto the system, adding your notes on, that done first because that's out of the way. But actually I have to concentrate quite hard to do that to make sure it's absolutely accurate. I'd rather be talking to people any day. I could do that all day long without writing anything on any records and without writing reports very happily. It's never going to happen, in my age at least. So, what you might think there is putting things off and leaving them on my to-do list, which I find stressful because I keep looking at it, is something that makes sense because actually that task doesn't fulfill my desire to be sociable. So then it starts to make a bit more sense, and then it leads into, okay, so what might I do about that? I'll come to that in a second. But another thing you could do is take a construct and do some pyramiding. So that's really saying, if I saw you putting the writing recording tasks off, what would I notice about you? What would I see? What you would see is I might be making a cup of tea, I might be emailing, I might even be reading the staff briefing if it's really bad and I really don't want to get started with it. And instead of putting them off, if I was shutting myself away to do them, what would you see? You might see me sitting in an office with emails and Teams switched off, so I have no contact with anybody in order to get the task done. So pyramiding looks at the details, and it's useful because you may find things that if the person is having a problem with something and they want to change, you might find them through pyramiding. You will understand them through the laddering, but you might find small things that could be tweaked which are less threatening or anxiety provoking because they're smaller changes. So then the next step is to think, okay, so how might you reconstrue your relationship with admin or your admin now you've done that exploration? So for me, I might think, okay, I need to find some ways where I can be sociable but also get the reports done. How can that happen? So it could be I arrange with a colleague to kind of do what are called sprints. So writing alongside each other. So maybe that's on Teams, which means we're in a meeting and we're both busy, but we have the camera off, we have the sound off, and we meet up after an hour and we have a cup of tea and then we do it again. The other thing would be to set aside time for writing, which isn't going to be very useful for meetings with colleagues or making calls, like pick-up time or, when parents have got their children at home. Those aren't good times to speak to families at all. So those could be my writing times. So remember that putting things off is only a problem if it causes you stress. If it doesn't cause you any stress, it might just be the way you like to work. It could be that you want to leave it to the last minute because you're thinking it over. And sometimes I do this. So I've been thinking about this podcast episode for 2 weeks about what I'm going to do. And it's now the 31st and I'm recording it, and it might be a day late because I have been on holiday. But I've been thinking about it all that time and I didn't want to do it before I got my thoughts sorted out. And I've had some practices of writing this document and see if I could make it work. So that putting off wasn't time wasted. The idea of it was to make it something better in the end. And you might do this with some of the things you put off. You maybe don't want to clean the kitchen floor and you don't do it because you know you don't have the time at the moment to do it properly. I bet I could do it very, very quickly, but some people do it a lot better than me. And if you've got a higher standard, you might think, well, I've only got 5 minutes. I haven't got time to mop the floor because it won't be done to the right standard. It's better to leave it till later on and I'll be able to do it properly over 10 minutes. So putting stuff off is not necessarily bad or good. It just depends on your personal construing. And I think it's important to remember that because quite often people can feel they are failures in some way or another because they're struggling to get admin tasks done. Actually, what they're doing is doing things that are related to their core constructs, and they are making choices, maybe not that they're even aware of, but they're making choices between things all of the time. Things that could be done now or things that could be done later. So that's not a bad thing to make a choice. There's a freedom associated with that, and there's a sort of self-efficacy. So if you can think of it like that, maybe you can think, okay, so which are the things where I might want to have a bit more of that? Are there ways that I can have a bit more control over things in a comfortable way? Or shall I leave everything to the last second? Not do any scheduling of tasks or anything like that, but just leave it until the day it's due in. I don't like doing that, and it's only happened with this because I've gone on holiday, and I'm only just back. So it's been tricky and a bit stressful for me because it's not the way that I would ideally like to do it. However, it's been okay. I've survived, hopefully. Okay, so that document is going to be on the website. If you use it with a colleague, I think that would be very interesting if you both look at the same elements, because you might be able to pick things up from someone else's ideas about the kind of ways that they think about it and address it. But it will certainly be an interesting discussion between you. Okay, so I think that's about it. I would encourage you to give it a go and just to see what you make of it. And ideally, if you think you might have clients that you might use it with, do it with yourself first. Don't make the first time you use it be one that really matters. Make sure it's, using it on yourself first so that you can get a feel for it. And I will see you again next month. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Bye.